The room buzzed with excitement as friends, family, and colleagues filled the hall to celebrate Richard's retirement. He was known as a successful, dedicated man who had poured his life into his career. Around the room, displays of his achievements and photographs from various stages of his career decorated the walls. Guests laughed, shared stories, and toasted to Richard's success, their admiration for him clear in every word and smile. At the center of it all stood Richard himself, beaming with pride as he accepted handshakes and hugs, his charismatic presence lighting up the room. Beside him was his wife, Margaret, who stood with quiet composure, her hand resting on his arm. She smiled politely at guests and nodded as they complimented her on supporting Richard through his long career. She looked every bit the proud wife, her demeanor calm, almost serene. But beneath her polished exterior, a different story simmered. Tonight wasn't just Richard's retirement party, it was Margaret's reckoning. She had been waiting for this moment, her silence masking a pain she had carried for years. This night, she told herself, was going to be her turning point. As the party progressed, Richard's longtime friends and colleagues took turns delivering speeches. They spoke about his dedication, his hard work, and, above all, his loyalty to his company, his friends, and his family. Each word seemed to sting Margaret, digging up memories she had tried to bury. When a close friend joked about Richard's many late nights at the office and his unbreakable bond with his secretary Caroline, the crowd erupted in laughter, thinking it harmless. Richard chuckled along with them, a hint of pride in his eyes, but Margaret's expression hardened, her polite smile slipping for just a moment before she regained her composure. As the evening wore on, Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She had spent years watching her husband present this perfect image to the world, enduring the quiet, painful betrayal she'd discovered long ago. It had started with small suspicions, a few late nights here and there, odd phone calls at strange hours. But over time she had uncovered the truth, piece by painful piece. Richard and Caroline were more than just a boss and secretary. They shared a relationship that went far beyond professionalism. Margaret had found receipts, notes, and gifts, each one a piece of evidence that painted a picture of deceit and betrayal. And all the while, she had kept it to herself, playing the role of the dutiful wife for the sake of their family and reputation. As Richard continued to soak in the praise, Margaret's grip tightened around her wineglass. She had stood by, silent, for years. She had defended him, even as she knew the truth. But tonight, in front of everyone he cared about, she could no longer hold back. She felt a surge of strength and clarity she hadn't felt in years. The world needed to know who Richard truly was, and tonight she would be the one to reveal it. Just as the last speaker finished, Richard took the microphone, preparing to thank everyone for their support and friendship. But before he could begin, Margaret stepped forward, her voice calm but unwavering as she addressed the crowd. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to her, surprised by the unexpected interruption. "I'd like to say a few words, if I may," Margaret began, her gaze fixed on Richard. Her voice was gentle but filled with purpose. Richard, caught off guard, smiled awkwardly and stepped aside, allowing her to take the spotlight. He looked at her with a mix of confusion and unease, sensing something he hadn't anticipated. Margaret's hands were steady, her expression unyielding as she faced the crowd. "For years, I've stood by this man," she began, her words carrying through the room with a strength that silenced even the faintest whispers. 40 years of marriage, of loyalty, and of trust, or so I thought. The room held its breath, the faintest murmurs fading as Margaret's words settled over the crowd. Faces shifted from joy to confusion, curiosity turning to unease. Richard's smile wavered, his once confident expression betraying a flicker of alarm. Margaret stood calmly, her gaze steady on him, her voice unwavering as she spoke. For years, I believed in Richard's dedication, his commitment to our family, and his loyalty, she continued, her tone unhurried but filled with the weight of unspoken truths. I trusted that his late nights, his missed family dinners, were all sacrifices made for his work. I wanted to believe that his absence was simply the cost of his ambition, of the life he was building for us. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd, noting the concerned expressions of friends and family members who were now hanging on her every word. But as the years went on, I began to see things I couldn't ignore. She turned her gaze back to Richard, who now looked visibly uncomfortable, his hands clenching at his sides. Strange messages, unexplained expenses, secrets kept too carefully. Bit by bit, the pieces came together. Her voice softened, tinged with sadness. Until I could no longer pretend. A gasp escaped from someone in the audience, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. Richard shifted uneasily, his face taut as he struggled to maintain his composure. Margaret held up a hand, quieting the murmurs, her voice growing colder as she spoke again. "I found out about Caroline," she said, her words slicing through the silence. "Your loyal secretary, the woman you shared more than just a job with. For years, you've kept her by your side, hidden in plain sight, thinking I wouldn't see. But I saw it all. Every late night, every excuse. It wasn't for work. It was for her." The shock in the room was palpable, guests exchanging bewildered glances as the perfect image of Richard began to crumble before their eyes. Margaret took a steadying breath, the pain and anger of years of betrayal radiating in her voice. "I kept it to myself, Richard. I stayed quiet, even as you continued with this charade, because I believed that somehow things could still be fixed, that you would realize what you were risking." Richard opened his mouth, as if to protest, but no words came. He looked around the room, desperation and fear creeping into his expression as he saw the disbelieving stares of friends, family and colleagues who had come to celebrate him. Margaret's gaze never left him, her expression hardened by years of silent suffering. "But there's something else," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper that compelled the crowd to lean in, captivated. "Something you didn't think I'd ever find out. Something that should have stayed hidden." Her words hung in the air, thick with suspense. Richard's face drained of color, his eyes widening as Margaret's implications settled over him. The guests began to murmur again, their confusion turning to suspicion, as if they too sensed that the affair wasn't the full story. Margaret paused, letting the tension grow, her gaze sharp and unrelenting. "Caroline," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "won't be joining us tonight." She let the words hang, a chill spreading through the room. "She's gone." The silence was absolute, as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on everyone. Richard looked stunned, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. His voice shook as he tried to find words. What do you mean, Margaret?" he stammered, his eyes wide. Margaret held his gaze, her expression both resolute and hauntingly calm. "I think you know exactly what I mean, Richard," she said softly, her tone a mixture of sadness and accusation. "And so do the police." The air was thick with shock, the once festive atmosphere replaced by a tense, almost suffocating silence. Every face in the room was fixed on Margaret, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and horror. Richard stared at her, his mouth slightly open, his hands trembling as he absorbed her words. He looked as though he'd been struck, his confident composure shattered, replaced by a dawning fear. "The police?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze darting between Margaret and the stunned crowd. He seemed to shrink under her steady, unwavering stare. "Yes, Richard," she said, her voice calm but heavy with purpose. They came to see me this morning with questions. Questions about your relationship with Caroline, questions about her sudden disappearance. She paused, letting her words sink in. The crowd murmured and a few guests exchanged uneasy glances, the tension mounting as they tried to make sense of Margaret's revelation. Richard's face twisted, a flicker of anger mingling with his fear. "Margaret, this is insane," he stammered, a faint edge of desperation creeping into his tone. "I had nothing to do with Caroline's disappearance. You're overreacting. She's probably just away, taking time off." Margaret tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his. "Really?" she asked, her voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to unnerve him further. "Then why were you the last person seen with her, Richard? Why were you seen leaving her house late the night before she disappeared?" A fresh wave of gasps swept through the room. Richard's eyes darted around, searching for an ally among the faces that had once looked up to him with admiration. But all he found were cold, accusing stares. He was alone, the walls of his carefully constructed life closing in around him. "She confided in me, you know," Margaret continued, her tone softer now, almost regretful. "She came to me just last week, trembling, saying she was afraid. She mentioned something about secrets she couldn't bear anymore, things you'd been asking her to hide." Margaret's gaze hardened, her words growing more pointed. "She wanted to come clean, to expose the lies, but she was terrified of what you might do." The crowd hung on her every word, spellbound by the terrible picture she was painting. Richard's protests were lost in the rising tide of unease, the guests now watching him with a mixture of suspicion and disgust. Richard shook his head, a weak denial escaping his lips. "This is madness," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're twisting everything, Margaret. Caroline was just tired. She needed space." Margaret took a step closer, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "You've lived a life of secrets, Richard. You're so used to lying that you don't even know the truth anymore." Her eyes flashed, her tone cutting through the silence. "But it's over. You can't hide behind me or anyone else anymore. The police are looking into everything now. Your financial records, your calls to her, all the things you thought you'd kept buried." Richard's face went pale, his bravado crumbling. The weight of her words and the accusations in the eyes around him seemed to drain the fight from him. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, exposed in a way he had never been before. The crowd remained silent, stunned by the gravity of Margaret's revelations. The truth, ugly and unfiltered, was now laid bare for everyone to see. The room seemed to close in on Richard, the faces around him blurred as a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Margaret's gaze remained locked on him, unflinching, her voice calm and deliberate as she spoke, each word striking with precise force. "For years, you built this image," she continued, her tone unwavering. "This picture-perfect life, where you were the devoted husband, the loyal friend, the dedicated professional. You fooled everyone, Richard. You fooled them all." She swept her hand toward the crowd, her eyes filled with years of pent-up anger and disappointment. "But the truth has a way of coming out, even when you bury it deep." Richard's face contorted with a mixture of fear and anger, a desperate plea hidden beneath his thinning composure. "Margaret, stop this," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're humiliating me. You're humiliating us." A bitter smile touched Margaret's lips. "Us?" she echoed, her voice laced with irony. "There hasn't been an us in years, Richard. Not since you decided to bring someone else into our marriage, someone who was supposed to be just a part of your job, but who became so much more." Her eyes softened briefly, tinged with sadness, before they hardened again. "And now, because of you, she's gone." The crowd murmured again, the shock deepening as the weight of Margaret's words settled over them. Friends, family, and colleagues looked at each other in bewilderment, some whispering, others casting looks of disgust and pity toward Richard. The accusations now hung in the air, impossible to ignore, forcing them all to see him in a new, unflattering light. Margaret took a step forward, closing the distance between herself and Richard. She spoke softly, her voice low but powerful, every word carrying the finality of a sentence passed down. "Caroline's death isn't just a tragic accident, Richard. It's a consequence of the lies you've spun and the people you've hurt. She wanted to escape, to reveal what she knew, but you couldn't allow it, could you? You were willing to risk everything to keep your secrets." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound emerged, his words lost in the torrent of accusations. He shook his head, his face pale, the fight draining from him. Margaret's gaze was unyielding, filled with a strength that seemed to dwarf him, her presence demanding that he face the truth he had long avoided. "And now," she said, her voice steady, "there's no place left to hide. The police will do their job, and they'll find the answers." She paused, the weight of her words pressing down on him as she delivered her final damning blow. "I only hope you're prepared for what they'll uncover." The silence was profound, punctuated only by Richard's shallow breathing as he realized the gravity of what lay ahead. For the first time, he truly appeared alone, the support of friends and family visibly crumbling as they began to step away, both literally and figuratively, from the man they thought they knew. Margaret took a deep breath, her expression softening as she looked at the man who had once been her partner, her confidant, her love. There was a trace of sorrow in her eyes, a recognition of what they had once shared and what had been lost along the way. But as she took one final step back, it was clear that she was ready to leave him and all his secrets behind. The silence weighed heavily as Margaret stepped back, her last words hanging in the air like a final, resounding judgment. Richard stood motionless, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. It was as though he had finally glimpsed the enormity of the damage he had caused, not just to his reputation, but to every relationship he had carefully crafted over the years. Around him, guests were backing away, their faces painted with shock, disappointment, and even pity, leaving him isolated in the center of the room. Margaret turned to face the crowd, her composure firm, though a hint of sadness softened her expression. Her voice, however, was steady, almost gentle, as she spoke to the friends and family who had gathered to celebrate her husband's career. "I know this is not what you expected tonight," she said, looking around the room. "You came here to honor a man you believed in, a man you respected." She paused, allowing her words to settle, her gaze drifting across familiar faces, friends who had supported her, colleagues who had admired Richard, and family who had seen him as a pillar of strength. "I was that person once too," she continued, a note of wistfulness coloring her tone. "I believed in him, in the life we built together. But sometimes, what we think we know is only a part of the story." She took a deep breath, her voice filling with both strength and vulnerability. "And tonight, I wanted to share the truth, because no one should have to carry the burden of another's lies alone." The crowd remained silent, each person processing her words, feeling the impact of her honesty. For years, they had seen her as the quiet, supportive wife who stood by Richard's side through every achievement, every celebration. But now, they saw her differently, not as a shadow in his life, but as a woman of resilience and integrity who had finally claimed her voice. Richard's gaze drifted down, his shoulders slumped, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a man stripped of his illusions. He seemed to age before their eyes, the weight of his choices pressing down on him, his usual confidence gone, replaced by a frail attempt to deny the reality closing in on him. The doors at the back of the hall swung open, and two uniformed police officers stepped inside, their expressions serious as they scanned the room, taking in the stunned silence. They made their way through the crowd, their purposeful steps echoing against the polished floors, until they stopped in front of Richard. One of the officers spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Richard Harrison, we have some questions for you regarding the recent disappearance of Caroline Hughes." Richard's face went pale, his eyes widening with fear as he looked from the officers to Margaret, as if seeking some reprieve, some denial of the reality unfolding around him. Margaret's expression was unreadable, a quiet strength holding her gaze steady as she watched him. There was no satisfaction, no hint of vindication, only a resolute acceptance of the path he had set for himself. She knew that whatever happened next, this moment marked a turning point not only for him, but for her as well. Richard's hands trembled as he stammered, This is a mistake. I haven't done anything wrong. You can't. I didn't." But his words faltered, lost in the gaze of the officers who stood before him, their faces impassive, unyielding. The lead officer exchanged a look with his partner before addressing the room. "This is just a part of an ongoing investigation. We ask for everyone's cooperation." His tone was professional, but the weight of his words left no room for misunderstanding. Margaret watched as Richard was gently but firmly guided toward the exit, his protests growing weaker as the realization of his isolation set in. No one in the room moved to help him. No one offered words of comfort. In that instant, he seemed to comprehend the full measure of what he had lost, not just his reputation, but the respect, trust, and love of everyone who had once looked up to him. As the doors closed behind him, a profound silence settled over the hall, as though a chapter had ended. And in that silence, Margaret felt a strange calm wash over her, a release from years of buried pain, a freedom she had never thought possible. She stood tall, no longer a silent witness to her own life, but the author of her own story, ready to face whatever came next. The silence lingered, heavy and thick, as the doors closed, sealing Richard's exit from the life he had once commanded so confidently. Margaret remained at the center of the room, feeling the eyes of everyone upon her, a mixture of awe, sympathy, and respect now coloring their gazes. She took a deep breath, letting the calm settle over her, a calm born not from triumph, but from release. This was not a victory. It was simply the truth, laid bare. Slowly, a few people began to approach her. An old friend, someone who had known both Margaret and Richard for decades, stepped forward, his face softened by empathy. "Margaret, I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "We had no idea. You carried this all by yourself." Margaret gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. I think I needed to carry it alone for a time. But tonight, it felt right to finally let it go." She glanced around, her gaze meeting the faces of others who had come to share in the celebration, people who had once been charmed by Richard's charisma and strength. Now they looked at Margaret with a newfound admiration. A few of her closest friends came forward, enveloping her in quiet support, offering words of comfort and gentle touches on her arm. Margaret felt the warmth of their presence, a stark contrast to the years of isolation she had endured. She was not alone anymore. She had reclaimed her life, her story, and her truth. For the first time, she felt that she could finally move forward, free from the shadow Richard's deception had cast over her. One of Margaret's oldest friends took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "I don't know how you endured all those years, Margaret," she whispered, her eyes filled with admiration. "But I'm so proud of you for standing up tonight, for finally letting go." Margaret nodded, a gentle smile forming on her lips. "I think I'm proud of myself, too," she admitted softly, the realization settling within her. She had spent so many years doubting her worth, questioning her own instincts, and suppressing her voice. But tonight she had proven, to herself most of all, that she was stronger than she had ever known. As she made her way toward the exit, the soft evening air greeted her, fresh and cool, carrying with it a sense of possibility. She paused, taking in the quiet stillness of the night, feeling a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had shed the past, left behind the lies, and reclaimed her dignity. Now she could finally begin again. Standing alone under the night sky, Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, breathing in deeply, savoring the newfound freedom coursing through her. Her life was hers once more, free from the constraints of deceit and betrayal. She had found the strength to walk away, to reclaim herself, and to face whatever awaited her with clarity and courage. And as she opened her eyes, a sense of peace settled within her, a quiet understanding that life would go on, and that from here she would walk her own path, guided by honesty, resilience, and the strength she had found within. As Margaret stood beneath the night sky, breathing in the calm, she felt a profound sense of closure washing over her. The weight of the years she had spent living in the shadow of Richard's secrets had finally lifted, leaving her lighter, almost renewed. She lingered a moment longer, taking in the quiet, her mind beginning to untangle the web of thoughts that had consumed her for so long. The doors to the hall opened behind her, and a few remaining guests trickled out, some offering her a nod of respect or a gentle smile as they left. One woman, a family friend, approached Margaret with tears in her eyes, reaching out to take her hands. "I can't imagine how hard this has been for you, Margaret," she said softly. "But I hope you know you're not alone. You have all of us, always." Margaret squeezed her hands, a genuine warmth filling her heart. For so long she had felt like she was adrift, carrying her burden alone, isolated in her pain. But now, looking into the faces of those who supported her, she realized she had a new foundation, one built on truth and empathy, not on pretense and silence. She nodded, a quiet gratitude settling over her. "Thank you," she replied, her voice filled with sincerity. "That means more to me than you know." The friend gave her one last, reassuring squeeze before heading off into the night, leaving Margaret to her thoughts. She looked up at the stars, feeling an unexpected clarity. In a way, Richard's betrayal had forced her to find a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had spent years feeling diminished, questioning her worth and doubting her instincts. Yet, standing here now, she understood that his actions didn't define her. They had only unveiled the courage she had always had within. As she took a step forward, she felt a gentle resolve blooming in her heart. Life would go on. She would rebuild. She would find herself again on her own terms. And in doing so, she would not allow bitterness to overshadow the lessons she had learned. The pain Richard had caused her would serve as a reminder that integrity and truth were the foundations of any real happiness, any genuine connection. And that strength wasn't found in enduring lies, but in finding the courage to confront them. She turned, finally walking away from the hall, each step steady and sure. Margaret had no illusions about the road ahead. She knew there would be moments of grief, times when memories resurfaced, and shadows of the past tried to creep in. But she had resolved that these would not control her. She was stronger than she had ever known, and she had earned her freedom through truth, through resilience, through her unshakable commitment to herself. In the quiet of the night, with only the soft rustling of leaves and the distant hum of city lights, Margaret began to envision a future she hadn't dared to dream of, a future where she was finally free, no longer tethered to someone else's deceit. It was hers now, wholly and completely. And with every step into the night, she embraced the woman she had become, a woman who would move forward with dignity, courage, and a heart open to the world. As Margaret continued down the quiet street, she felt an inner stillness settle over her, a sensation of completeness she hadn't felt in years. The weight of Richard's betrayal, the years of quiet endurance, and the ache of living a lie had all been lifted. With every step, she was leaving behind a life that had once defined her, but no longer had a hold on her. Now her future stretched before her like an open road, filled with possibilities that were entirely her own. Her mind wandered to the moral lesson she had drawn from this painful journey, a truth that had revealed itself slowly through the years of silence and finally blossomed in tonight's confrontation. Life, she had realized, was not about presenting a flawless facade to the world. It wasn't about holding on to something just because others expected it of you. Real strength lay in facing the truth, no matter how difficult, and in having the courage to walk away from what no longer served you. For years, she had convinced herself that staying silent was noble, that it was a form of strength to preserve the image of their marriage for the sake of family, friends, and reputation. But now she saw it differently. True loyalty wasn't about remaining in a situation that stifled her spirit. It was about staying loyal to herself, to her own well-being, and to the truth she knew deep down. By choosing to finally speak her truth, she had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her self-worth. As she walked, a lightness filled her steps, as if her spirit was gradually lifting, freed from the burden she had carried alone for so long. She reflected on the people who had been by her side, both tonight and throughout her life, the friends who had unknowingly supported her even when she felt isolated, the family who stood by her in quiet understanding, and the people who had gathered tonight, offering her strength and compassion in the face of an unimaginable revelation. Margaret thought about the lesson she wanted others to take from her story. Life could be messy, filled with unexpected twists and betrayals that could shake even the strongest among us. But there was always a way forward. In her heart, she hoped her story would encourage others to confront their own truths, to stand firm in their own dignity, and to recognize that walking away from deception wasn't a defeat, it was a victory of self-respect. Ahead, she saw the soft lights of a cafe still open late into the evening. On impulse, she decided to step inside, savoring this quiet moment of solitude and reflection. She ordered a tea, settling into a corner booth, letting the warmth of the cup soothe her hands. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace, surrounded by the soft hum of life moving around her. She was alone, but she felt whole, filled with a quiet strength that needed no validation from anyone else. As she sipped her tea, she gazed out the window at the street beyond, her mind drifting to the days and years ahead. She would rebuild, create a life that was entirely her own, shaped by her values and no one else's expectations, and she would do it with the knowledge that she had survived betrayal, that she had reclaimed her power, and that she had found a strength within herself that could carry her through any challenge. In that quiet cafe, under the gentle glow of streetlights, Margaret allowed herself to dream again, to imagine a future where she was free, fulfilled, and at peace. She didn't know exactly where this path would take her, but she was ready to walk it, one steady, purposeful step at a time. As the minutes drifted by in the cozy cafe, Margaret felt a warmth blooming within her, a feeling she could only describe as hope. She hadn't felt this sensation in years. It was as if she were finally seeing the world through her own eyes, no longer clouded by the weight of another's betrayal. Each sip of tea seemed to ground her further in this new reality, a life she was free to shape on her own terms. Outside, the streets had grown quieter, with only the occasional passerby, a gentle reminder that life carried on, oblivious to her transformation. Margaret thought about the possibilities awaiting her. For so long, she had planned her life around Richard's ambitions, his needs, his choices. Now, she felt the strange yet exhilarating responsibility of crafting a life centered on her own dreams and desires, things she had set aside long ago, thinking they were too small or unimportant. In the back of her mind, she began to outline a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. Perhaps she would finally pursue the art classes she had once dreamed of, painting the landscapes and scenes she had only admired from afar. Or maybe she would travel, visiting places she'd only read about in books, immersing herself in cultures and experiences beyond her small, familiar world. The idea filled her with a sense of freedom, of unbounded potential. As she considered these new directions, Margaret was struck by another realization. All those years of silence, of enduring Richard's lies and his betrayals, had not been wasted. They had taught her resilience, patience, and the power of standing alone. She had discovered a depth of strength within herself, a steady flame that had refused to be extinguished even in the darkest moments. It was this flame that had guided her to tonight's confrontation, that had allowed her to finally step forward and reclaim her voice.